Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the first collaboration of New South Wales Public Libraries for online author events. It is wonderful to know that there are library members from across the state joining us here this evening. I hope that you have something nice to eat and drink. You can just sit back and relax and enjoy the conversation with James Bradley. If you have any questions at any point this evening, you can use the Q&A box down the bottom, and we will get to audience questions towards the end of the hour. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all meeting. For me, I'm on Wiradjuri country. I pay respect to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other First Nations people. I celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal cultures and languages. So my name is Amy Heap and I'm a librarian at the Riverina Regional Library. And it is my pleasure to introduce one of my favourite Australian authors, James Bradley. James is a novelist and critic, and amongst his work you'll find five novels for adults, a book of poetry. He edited the Penguin Book of the Ocean and has published 2/3 of a young adult trilogy. But tonight we are celebrating his latest novel, Ghost Species. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much, Amy.
So in some ways it is sad that we can't do this in real life, in person, but there are advantages. For a start, we're essentially having an author talk in 20 libraries at once. And I'm probably not the only person who is in her Ugg boots, so we can all get comfortable. We do what we can in these strange times. What have been your highlights and lowlights of the pandemic experience?
Sorry, before I will answer that, but you talk about wearing Ugg boots. When I first left university, there's a completely random story I'm going to tell. When I first left university, I was a lawyer and I worked for a judge for a year. And the judge I worked for was a nudist. And he used to have photos of himself all over the walls at the beach with his friends, but he also used to spend the whole summer, he had a red leather lounge and he would spend the whole summer in the chambers in red Speedos. He would lie around on this red leather lounge in his red Speedos all summer reading and putting the judgments together. But when we used to do in chambers events in the summer, he would put on his bar jacket and shirt, but he'd remain in his Speedos on the bottom half, and he'd sit behind the bar table like half naked from the waist down. But a completely random and inappropriate story. Look, I think that it's funny. I've had 2 conversations in recent days with people who one of whom is down in Melbourne in lockdown again, and another one is up here in Sydney, and both of them have said, look, I'm having a really hard time, and I think one of the things that's been really striking to me about talking to people is that we all feel like, because there's this kind of superficial normality, we feel like it should be okay, and I think lots of people it isn't okay. I think lots of people, they're really, really struggling. And I think that sense of just being emotionally not quite where you should be, of kind of being knocked off beam all the time, of being really easy to kind of lose your way, is one of the things that certainly I've been finding it difficult, but I think lots of other people have been finding it really difficult.
Have there been any highlights? I follow Nick Harkaway on Instagram and he has made a lot of bread.
I have not made bread. I've done a lot of work. There have been highlights. I don't know. I mean, I actually think at a kind of intellectual level, it's been really, really fascinating watching that sense of the world. Like I feel as if a whole series of things which have been building for years and years and years have all just kind of hit together. And that's awful at one level. In the case of things like the Black Lives Matter stuff in America, it's really, really exciting at one level, but it's also just kind of fascinating, and in an odd kind of way. I feel bad finding it interesting, but it is really, really interesting, in an awful, boring, endless kind of way.
Well, it is a dystopia, essentially we are living a dystopia, but there have been positive impacts, on the environment, for example.
Yeah.
Do you think our attitudes have changed to the environment, and what would you like to see happen in the future as we sort of go on from this and possibly one day end in recovery from the pandemic, in terms of, you know, how we our attitude towards and our actions in regards to the environment?
Yeah, who knew the end of the world would be all about toilet paper and homeschooling? Well, I think the thing that's really interesting is it is a dystopia, but I think what it's revealed to a lot of people is that the world we were living in was already a dystopia. So I think that that's been really interesting. In terms of the environmental stuff, I think it's probably important not to overstate the, you know, it's great, emissions are down a bit because people are flying less, because businesses are working less, a series of things like that. But that doesn't really make any difference in the larger scheme of things, a drop over a few months. What is, I think, really interesting is what we've seen is that a whole series of things that we've been told were immovable and unchangeable for decades have turned out to be extremely movable and changeable. And in an odd kind of way, suddenly seeing that the world can change really fast, I think is something that's really encouraging, because it does show you that change is possible. All of these things that looked unchangeable are changeable. You know, what's that great line of Ursula Le Guin's, you know, capitalism seems permanent and unchangeable, but, you know, they said the same thing about the divine right of kings. Like, anything that humans make can be made, can be unmade.
Unmade, yeah, very true. Now, towards the beginning of the pandemic, there was some excitement, particularly in library circles, I suppose, when people thought that Dean Koontz had predicted the pandemic. You know, he'd had this virus called Wuhan 400 in 1981, a novel. I was rereading Clade recently. It had been a couple of years since I read it, and I'd forgotten about the pandemic section, which is much more like the current pandemic than Wuhan 400. And I will just point out that though I had forgotten that section, there were definitely other sections that had really stuck with me. It's not a forgettable novel. But, you know, people found that whole Dean Koontz thing really spooky, but your prediction was closer. You know, is it a spooky coincidence? Is it just a good guess, or is it some kind of inevitability?
I suspect it's the middle. I think it's a good guess. Oh, look, I mean, the book, for those people who haven't read it, the book is, Clade is a novel about a kind of family moving through about the next 70 years. And it's in 10 sections, and it hops forward, you know, 5 or 10 years each time. And kind of in the second half, there is a pandemic. And the pandemic begins in China. It begins to spread. The government tries to contain it and fails. The government covers it up and fails. And then it starts spreading around the world. And you're right, there's a whole lot of things that look an awful lot like this one. I mean, it's more deadly, and it's a flu rather. I'm wrong. It's a SARS-like illness. So it is in fact a coronavirus. You're right. But I mean, I think in terms of that, I mean, I don't think the kind of fiction I write, when you're writing about climate and things like that, when you're writing about the future, it's not intended to be predictive in that way. Like, I mean, what you're trying to do is to think about what the future might be like. And in a sense, you'll usually get the big stuff wrong, you know, but what you'll often get right are kind of small things. So my second novel, The Deep Field, is kind of set against the backdrop of kind of massive pro-democracy protests and a really violent government crackdown in Hong Kong. You know, so there is this kind of sense that it's often quite easy to see the general shape of where things are going, and you're trying to write into that. But the thing with both of these books, Clade, particularly because I wrote it a while ago, was that one of the things I was doing in it was taking some of the kind of climate science and trying to kind of use it in fiction to think about what the world might be like. And there's all these things that I took that were predictions from the literature, which were 20 years away, 30 years away. And over the last 5 years since the book was published, huge numbers of them have started coming true much, much faster than we thought they were going to. And I think that sense that you're being kind of lapped by reality is actually much, you know, with the climate stuff, is actually much spookier than it is with the pandemic things. I mean, the pandemic, you know, there was obviously going to be a pandemic at some point, you know, it's like, and you know, in mine, you know, a quarter of the world dies. So in a way it's quite wrong, you know, but that other stuff, that sense that the hastening of kind of the climate feedbacks of the climate disasters around us. You know, that sense that they're actually moving faster than the literature was predicting is really disturbing.
Quite scary. So your latest book, Ghost Species, sorry, it's also quite frighteningly prescient, given especially that it was written before the beginning of this year when we had a horror bushfire season and there are so many fires in it. Could you introduce the book for us?
Yeah. So Ghost Species is a novel. It kind of begins now. It's about there's a billionaire and he has called Davis Hucken, and he's kind of half Mark Zuckerberg, half Elon Musk, and all psychopath. And he has this scheme to re-engineer the world's climate by bringing back extinct species. So he wants to bring back mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and things to kind of recreate a kind of ice age environment up in the Arctic, and to kind of regenerate other environments around the world. But in the middle of that, he's got this secret scheme to bring back Neanderthals. And he wants to do that because he thinks that if we bring back Neanderthals, we will have to see ourselves differently. We will have to recognize that we are not a species apart from nature. We are just another species amongst all the species in nature, but we'll also, and also that we'll be forced to see ourselves through this other species' eyes. And so he finds these scientists, they genetically recover and create a Neanderthal child. And the book is really about that child growing up over about the next 20 years as the world unravels around her.
So the possibility of de-extinction of species like Neanderthals is, like, I found it utterly fascinating, and I hadn't considered it before. I didn't even know de-extinction was a word. How far-fetched is it as an idea, and did something in particular lead you to explore it?
Well, look, it's not far-fetched at all. I mean, it's something that they've certainly been working on. They've done a lot of preparatory work with things like thylacines. It's pretty far-fetched with things like mammoth and dinosaurs and Neanderthals, because we don't have the high-quality DNA that you need. But there are other, there are ways around some of that. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly something people are looking at. It's a way of bringing back kind of species. And I guess I came to it for a couple of reasons. One was I was thinking a lot about extinction. I was thinking a lot about, the kind of disappearance of animals, the disappearance of species, that sense of the thinning of the natural world. And once I started to think about this idea of kind of de-extinction, it made me think a bit about what we were losing. So we think about the extinction of a species as the loss of it's the loss of, we think of it as a loss of kind of DNA, like, kind of a genetic code goes out of the world. But in fact, it's much more than that. Species exist embedded and entangled in kind of environments. They have all of these complex relationships to things around them in their environment. And they also, lots and lots of them, have culture. So these animals have ways of being in the world, and so when we lose them, we lose that way of being in the world. But also when we bring them back, there's this kind of question about, what are we bringing back? Are we bringing back a kind of biological entity, or are we bringing back kind of what that animal was, which is much richer and deeper and wider thing than that? So I guess I've been thinking about that a bit. And I'd also been thinking a lot about kind of questions around climate. So one of the things I was really interested in was that sense that time is out of joint. I mean, because there is a sense always with climate change that, what it is a kind of derangement of temporality. I'm using the technical jargon, but, time is out of joint. It's this sense that things that should be taking tens of thousands of years, melting ice caps, changing environments, are taking place incredibly fast. We're releasing insane amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which should take thousands of years, and we're doing it in 10, kind of thing. So that kind of sense that time is out of joint, but also that sense that things from the deep past are kind of erupting into the present. That sense that mammoth of coming out of the melting permafrost, that dams are drying up and villages are appearing. That wonderful story from last year about the drought in Germany, and the river went down, and there were the stones that had been there since the Middle Ages, saying, if you see us, fear, like, and it just seemed to me this idea of bringing back this ancient species was such an amazing way of thinking about that sense of time being out of joint, of the deep time, of the deep past kind of bleeding into the present. So yeah, I mean, I'd kind of been thinking about a number of those kinds of things.
I think it certainly seems to me that Ghost Species is a book about, amongst other things, loss. The characters, they experience personal loss of people, of relationships, of identity, but also that universal loss of species, of habitat, of way of life. Do you think writing about global loss is kind of a way of processing all sorts of personal loss?
Look, one of the things I really wanted to do with this book is to find, I mean, look, yes, it is. I mean, I think that kind of, I think we find a lot of that kind of planetary loss very hard to think about. And one of the things you can do as a writer is kind of take people to a kind of more kind of personal loss and get them to think about those kind of personal, kind of extinctions that we deal with. And for, like, one of the things with the book for me very much was, it's kind of written in the middle of this kind of really odd time in my life. And my father died just as the book was kind of, as I was beginning the book. And my mother was really sick right across the time I was writing it, and died, in fact, just a few weeks before it came out. And so I was kind of writing about this sense of, I guess, of a kind of planetary catastrophe, which is one of the things the book's very much about, while also kind of wrangling all of that personal stuff, which, I mean, I guess it's a way of processing it. I guess it's a way of thinking about it, but it's also that I wanted with the book very much to kind of erase, I guess, some of those kind of boundaries in writing. I wanted to find a way of writing where there's kind of no barrier at all between me and the work, which sounds really strange, but I wanted that sense that this is a book that's kind of right in a kind of now that it's describing, right in a now that it's kind of experiencing. And so I guess it was drawing, I suppose it was drawing on all of that stuff quite closely.
And I found it very moving. And I think one clever way that you did that is, even though clearly parts of it are now in the future, it's not really futuristic in the sense of, strange things that people use or technology or things like that. It's still all felt very now.
Yeah, and that's absolutely deliberate. I mean, I wanted a book that, like, I didn't want there to be a big buy-in. Does that make sense? I didn't want, and it seems to me the kind of science fiction, if this is science fiction, the kind of speculative fiction, whatever you want to call it, that I really like, tends not to be the stuff that's about spacecraft and, empires and things like that. It's a much more mundane kind of science fiction where it's our world, but it's just pushed a little bit sideways or a little bit into the future. So you see, as these other things begin to intrude into the world, you see things about our world revealed, and that's the stuff that really fascinates me and feels really vital when I'm reading it.
So I actually read an article recently by Catherine Bush suggesting that all fiction written now is climate fiction. So she wrote this, that more usually the term refers to a genre of fiction that addresses the climate crisis directly, often within the broader genre of speculative fiction. But this compartmentalization enacts its own denials. All writers today write in relation to the climate and ecological crises, our planetary emergency, whether these things are acknowledged or not. So your latest novels, and I include the young adult trilogy in this, they definitely specifically and clearly address these issues. Is that kind of a deliberate choice, or can you not help but write what you see?
Look, it's partly a deliberate choice. I mean, I guess I came to this kind of writing about 10 or 12 years ago, and it was because I'd been thinking about this stuff a lot. And I in fact had been writing a book, and I got to the end of it, and it was going to be published, and I didn't like it, and I decided not to publish it. And And then I thought to myself, like, what is the thing that I'm really worried about? What is the thing that I really want to write about? Why aren't I writing about that? And the answer to that was kind of climate and environmental crisis. And so I started trying to work out how you'd write about them. And it's a reasonably difficult thing to work out because they're difficult things to write about. But I suppose, I mean, I do think that kind of fiction needs to address these things. So something that is really disturbing is that kind of sense that this is the biggest thing that we face. This is the biggest thing that's shaping our world. This is the thing that's going to transform our world over the next 20 years. And we barely talk about it. You know, I mean, Amitav Ghosh talks about the great derangement, that kind of sense of this kind of massive societal denial of where we are. And, you know, I didn't want to write books that were contributing to that process. I want to write books that were about trying to address and deal with those kinds of things.
I think so many people don't want to think about what the future holds. They, you know, would rather sort of deny the trajectory that the planet is on because they think it's depressing. But your novels are not depressing. Well, I don't think so. I have not found them to be depressing. How do you go about making your novels hopeful, knowing what you know about the climate and in the current climate?
I'm glad you don't find them depressing. Look, it is difficult stuff to write about. It is difficult stuff to think about. And I think that's one of the reasons we don't talk about it. You know, I mean, I think that one of the reasons we don't talk about climate is that, in fact, it's you know, it's completely overwhelming once you do start thinking about it. But what I also think is that denial and despair are kind of two sides of the same coin. They're a way of not thinking about things. I think that despair, you know, despair is great. Despair reassures us we're powerless. You know, despair tells us that there is nothing we can do. And the reality is, you know, with climate change, lots of the damage is done. You know, we are on track probably for 2 degrees at this point, you know, like, and it's going to be really, really bad. But there's a difference between 2 degrees and 3 degrees, and there's a difference between 3 degrees and 4 degrees. And, you know, what we need to start doing is having the, do you know what I mean? Like every little bit that you can pull it back is going to be better. So, I mean, it seems to me that one of the things I want, particularly, and one of the things I really want to do in Clade was to kind of make a space for that, you know, to kind of say, look, this is a book which is about the fact that the future doesn't stop happening. You know, that change doesn't stop happening, that, you know, even in the midst of kind of disaster, people are having children, you know, falling in love, you know, growing up, dying, you know, and that kind of procession of human life is a way of thinking about the fact that we can always make the world anew. Do you know what I mean? And this is one of the things I wanted to think about in Clade. And in this one, you know, Ghost Species is, I think, a much darker book than Clade in lots of ways. You know, it's about trying to think about despair, and it's trying to think about a whole series of questions about denial and what we don't talk about. But simultaneously, it's also trying to say, look, you know, there is still this kind of space for human connection. You know, we can find, you know, the solutions to our problems lie in kind of learning to see each other. The solutions to our problems lie in, you know, trying to build upon those kind of structures of care and community and empathy that hold us together. I'll stop in 2 seconds, but I've actually just been reading a fascinating book by a Dutch historian called Dagmar de Groot, and he was writing about the Little Ice Age, which was through the, you know, kind of reached its peak in the 15th and 16th century. Temperatures around the world came down by about 0.5 degree. Societies around the world were in dreadful, dreadful trouble. The Dutch flourished. You know, it's the Dutch Golden Age. And he wants to ask, so what did they do? How did they adapt? You know, and it seems to me that they're really, really useful questions. Not, you know, what we need to be doing is asking questions about what we can do, what do we change, how do we act? You know, and that's kind of what I want my fiction to kind of get people to a place where they're kind of asking those questions, I guess.
And I think that's the great thing about fiction, because it's not telling you what to do or what to think or what the only options are. It leads you to think for yourself about the possibilities.
Absolutely. And look, and I think a couple of things here. I mean, one of them is that one of the things that is very difficult about climate change is it's hard to imagine. You know, it's hard for us to think about it. And it seems to me that fiction is one of the ways we can make it real to ourselves. You know, we can actually understand what it's going to be like to live in that world. You know, it can push us towards questions. But also, you know, and I'm a bit wary. I'm always a bit wary. I found myself saying, if this is what I want the books to do, this is, you know, I want them to have this kind of effect on the world. And I find myself going back to Auden saying poetry makes nothing happen. You know, and there's a weird kind of way in which I think trying to make that what the books do is wrong, because what they're also just trying to do is to capture what it's like to be living in this moment. You know, what it's like to be living in a moment of this kind of, I guess, this kind of sense of a world spiraling out of control. So, I mean, they're very much about also trying to map, I guess, the kind of psychic landscape of living now.
Yeah, and that is the power of fiction. Now, I'm not going to give any spoilers for Ghost Species, of course, but I would like to read this tiny little passage about technology, because I don't know, I just found it fascinating. And this is where Kate, the main character, she finds herself disconnected and, well, she thinks she's unmonitored for a little while from, you know, all things technological. And this is what it says. So suddenly outside them, meaning those, you know, technology connections, she does not feel reduced or lonely, but somehow freer, more alive, more aware. Her attention not constantly flicking between screen and world. Sometimes she wonders whether she is also relieved to be away from the constant cataloguing of crisis, the drumbeat of disaster and atrocity that has suffused her existence for so long. Now, obviously, I'm not going to start denigrating technology in this online talk that I extensively promoted on social media. But I don't think it's a coincidence that your, I suppose, shadiest character in Ghost Species is a type of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. And technology connects us in so many ways, in those ways you were talking before about, you know, emotional and empathetic and all those sorts of things, but also in every aspect of our life. So I was just sort of wondering if you think we're kind of walking a tightrope with social media and that intrusion of technology and the power some people have because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very wedded to technology. I was away recently with a group of scientists in the Cocos Islands. One of the scientists is a scientist I know, and she works on remote islands. So she does this thing where she'll go away for, like, you know, literally they'll take her and two other people to an island in the middle of the Pacific and drop them there and say, we'll see you in 6 months, don't die. You know, and I mean, I was kind of hyperventilating while she was telling me this story, because it was just making me feel so anxious. You know, like, you know, it's like no internet for 6 months. But so you know, it's a bit rich me pretending that I think there's a problem with it. But I do think that, you know, we are in the midst of this massive transformation of the way we relate to each other. We are in the midst of a massive rethinking of a whole series of social structures. And at the moment, all of the decisions about those things are being taken by giant technology companies in America, you know, and they are disrupting labor, they are disrupting all of these kinds of things. And some of those things, some of those changes are positive, but a lot of them are not, you know, and a lot of them are about, I think, kind of embedding particular kinds of, I guess, kind of economic structures in our lives and social structures. And you know, and I do think we talk about connection, but I mean, I think what they also do is they do serve to kind of alienate us from each other. I mean, I think one of the things that's been really striking during the pandemic is seeing that we already live such atomized lives. You know, we already live in a way that it's quite easy to live in your house, never see anybody, order food in, you know, and there's a level at which if people want to do that, that's fine. But, you know, it's difficult not to feel that that's got to have at least something to do with the kind of rise in the problems with depression, with anxiety, with all of those kinds of things. And when I feel like myself, social media makes me incredibly anxious. Now, I don't think that we should set aside the fact that those things are intimately connected to a whole series of kind of economic things about kind of precariousness and stuff like that. But there is a level at which those technologies are one of the things that are restructuring our lives. And I think often removing us from each other in ways that are kind of quite scary, you know. I mean, but, you know, I'm also not a doomsayer. I mean, I think there's lots and lots of pluses in these technologies, but they are, you know, I feel like we've kind of handed a whole series of decisions over to technology companies, which perhaps we, you know, we should be making, the citizens should be making, about how we run our world. So, you know, makes me sound like a crazy lefty.
It is a mixed bag.
It is a mixed bag, as with many things, you know. I mean, look, you know, and when you know, kind of, I mean, there's all that stuff about, was it Socrates who was appalled by the idea that people might read text because then they wouldn't use their brains to, you know,
Yeah.
they would lose
Well, we
the
don't have to
power of
remember
memory.
anything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know,
I
our
don't
brains
know
would
my
go
own phone
soft.
number.
Albeit it's been all downhill since ancient Greece.
Yeah. Now, I came across Clade a few years ago because I suppose I was getting into climate fiction, and I came across it on a list. And at first I was, you know, really excited to find an Australian example. And also I think it has the most beautiful cover. It's actually, and I've got it here so I can show everybody how beautiful it is, blue or green. It is a really beautiful cover. And I'm pleased to report that the inside matched the cover. I really loved it. But I just wondered whether you have any favourites amongst other climate fiction. I know climate fiction is not necessarily your favourite term, but you know, are there other books that you suggest people read?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think climate fiction is a fantastic marketing tag. I think it's done a huge amount to help people think about there might be books that do these kinds of things. I'm not convinced that there is any identifiable thing that is climate fiction. It seems to me that what we should be thinking of this kind of stuff as is a kind of tangible condition like modernity, like it kind of touches everything, it changes everything. Having said that, yeah, look, I think there are a lot of wonderful books. There's a really fantastic book by Lucy Treloar, who's an Australian author, called Wolf Island, which came out last year, which is one of my favorite books in this space, and it's just a wonderful book. I think Jane Rawson's written fantastically in this space, another Australian. Her book From the Wreck is fantastic. It's about an alien octopus escaping to Earth, you know, and it's great, you know, and it's really powerful about all of those questions about kind of extinction and things like that. I would lump books like Annie Proulx's Barkskins in there. I think that's an incredibly powerful and interesting book. And Michael Christie's recent book, Greenwood, is also terrific. But I also think, oh, and Alexis Wright's Swan book. But I also think that, you know, there's really fantastic stuff happening over in science fiction. There's people like Kim Stanley Robinson who do just, you know, kind of extraordinary writing in this space. And Kim Stanley Robinson has written a series of novels recently, New York 2140, 2312, Aurora, and there's a new one coming out called The Ministry of the Future. And they're fascinating books because they're actually books which are about, they're kind of utopian climate fiction. So what they do is they say, we messed the world up. There were all of these problems, but there came a point where we kind of turned it around and built a better world. Now, I find them really fascinating books because they kind of want to dig into the kind of architecture of how that might happen. You know, New York 2140's got all this stuff about kind of risk indexes and things like that, where Robinson's gone away and thought really, really carefully about what the kind of financial structures that might underpin that world might be like. And they're incredibly exciting and kind of oddly liberating books to read.
We are recording this, everybody, so if you haven't been taking notes for your to-be-read list, you can come back and check those again. Have you read any other great books lately?
Yes, I've read a number. I just read the new Ali Smith book, the fourth of the season's books, which I thought was just wonderful. You know, like, I mean, I love her work. I love all of her work, but I think these four are kind of amazing. And people who don't know anything about them, she's written a series of 4 novels over 4 years and one for each season. And the idea is she was kind of writing them in the moment that the novels are set. So the first one, which is from 4 years ago, you know, Brexit's in it. The one that came out now has got the pandemic in it. You know, and to be honest, the pandemic stuff feels a bit like she went racing in a proof stage and stuck a few passages in, but, you know, but it's there, you know, I mean, it's kind of all of it. The bushfires in Australia are there, you know, so there's this sense that these books that are collapsing that space between, you know, there's no sense that the books are trying to look back at something. They're actually about what's happening right now, and they're just beautiful books, you know. I've just read Tegan Bennett, Daylight's new book, The Details, which is a series of essays, you know, about the death of her mother, about reading, about writing, and they're wonderful. You know, I mean, they're a really fabulous, incredibly carefully thought through set of essays, which, you know, tried to talk about kind of an idea of kind of attentiveness as a kind of ethic, that kind of sense of looking at the world and trying to see it as well as you can. I think what else I've read recently that I really liked. My brain's turning to porridge at this precise moment about what I've read recently. I've just read, I read a very, very entertaining biography of the Beatles, which is going to sound weird, by Craig Brown, which is called 1, 2, 3, 4, and is a fantastic kind of, you know, it's this kind of non-narrative biography of the Beatles, and about basically just it's one kind of anecdote after another, and it's incredibly funny and entertaining.
That doesn't sound weird at all. No,
it was fabulous. And what else I read? Garth Nick's new book is terrific. The Left-Handed Booksellers of London. I read The Yield, which I thought was very, very good. And I've read quite a bit of poetry, actually. I read some Alice Oswald, a terrific book called 3 Poems, I think, by Hannah Sullivan. Oh, and one other thing I've read, which is great, and I don't know if you get it here, you might have to order it, is I read this funny American novel called Barn 8 by a woman called Deb Olin Unferth. And it is a book about environmental activists trying to steal chickens from a giant chicken farm in America, and it's fantastic. I mean, it's not the greatest book ever written, but it's really funny and alert and strange, and I really, really enjoyed it. You know, so yeah. Oh, Chris Flynn's book Mammoth is terrific, and now I'm going to stop listing books in a crazy kind of way.
I need to have your job. I'm a librarian, and I don't read as much as that. What would be your favourite book, or top 5 if you can't limit it?
Oh, my favourite book. Look, a friend of mine sent me a very funny message the other night, and she said she's locked down in Melbourne and she's been reading The Farthest Shore, so she's been reading the Earthsea trilogy, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, which are 3 of my favourite books in the world. I just think particularly the first and the third are they're perfect novels. They're wonderful. But she said she was locked up in the house. She had this copy of it. She was reading it, and she got to the end and realized the last 3 pages were missing. And she sent me this text going, "Have you got a copy? You have to send me the pages." But so that would be one of my favorite books of all time. And then, you know, kind of a lot of older books. I love Henry James. I love Middlemarch. In fact, I love all of it. Eliot. I like Dickens very much, unfashionable as he is. I just saw the movie, actually, which I thought was terrific. The Iannucci movie of David Copperfield, which I thought was just wonderful.
Yes, I can't wait.
Yeah,
I also love Dickens.
So do I. He's very unfashionable these days, but he's wonderful. Arctic Dreams, the Barry Lopez book, is a book that kind of changed my life when I read it. David Malouf's An Imaginary Life. So lots of things I can never name. People are like, "What's your favorite book?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Depends what day of the week you ask."
Yes.
Me. You know.
Now this is a personal one. Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights?
Oh, Jane Eyre.
Oh. That is the right answer. Yeah, I keep a tally. I ask all authors that. Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. And you are on the right side.
Oh, clearly. But 2 things. One thing I find fascinating about Jane Eyre is that it's actually very strange and very gothic. Like, it's a very odd book when you read it. And in my mind, in a sense, I always think of it as like, we come to think of it as the kind of straight-laced, intelligent, you know, opposite to Wuthering Heights. In fact, it's very weird. You know,
yeah, they're both weird.
They're both. Well, but Wuthering Heights, like, you read Wuthering Heights, and it is this wild, dirty, kind of crazy book, and you think, if it feels like that to me in the 21st century, what did it feel like in the 19th century? Like,
they're also horrible.
Oh, they're ghastly. But, you know, there's this seething kind of sexual energy in it when you read it. You know, it's fascinating. It's a fantastic. They're both fantastic.
Now, what is next for you? Now, there's something that I am waiting for, as I have my 2. This is your young adult trilogy, but one is missing.
Yeah, no,
Where are we up
the
to
third
on
is
that?
on the third is on the way. It's written, it's on the way, but it's been a bit delayed, so it'll come.
Okay, good.
Although I must say, I was looking at it the other day and realizing that I need to change a whole series of things. But I'm writing a new novel. In fact, I'm writing two new novels. One of which is kind of first draft stage, and the other I've written less of. And is completely not about climate, so that's kind of exciting, or different and interesting. And I'm working on a non-fiction book. I've been writing a lot of non-fiction, mostly kind of essays about stuff connected to the ocean, which has been really, really interesting. You know, so in a weird kind of way, it's like the next step from that book. I did that book of the ocean for Penguin about 10 years ago, and that was that was a kind of collection of other people's writing, whereas this one is kind of essays about the ocean. And I've published some of them, and I've got a couple more coming out soon. So I'm kind of building towards a book of those,
Well, you are clearly being very prolific. Do you have a secret? I'm sure there are some writers in the audience. What is your best piece of advice?
I have written quite a lot in the last few years. My advice would actually be the opposite, which is it's okay not to be productive at the moment, because I think lots of people aren't. And I think when I said before that I think it's actually okay not to be okay and to feel overwhelmed, because I think lots of people do. I think in a weird way for me, I've had so much going on in my life over the last kind of 12 months that just writing's been a real refuge. So having this thing I can kind of control, this thing that I can go and do every day has actually been wonderful. Like it's been this kind of something that I can do. So in a weird kind of way, it's not that I've been super productive, it's that being productive has allowed me not to kind of completely fall to pieces.
Now we have some really excellent questions from the audience. I'm going to open up the Q&A box and go to those. And I'll just mention for everybody that we will be sharing this video on the Riverina Regional Library's YouTube page, so that you can come back and get all of these reading suggestions. So I'll just open up my Q&A. So Charlotte would like to know what your writing process is like.
Chaos. Look, so I tend to, if I'm writing fiction, it's pretty chaotic. I'm not a planner particularly. What I tend to do is to write, I kind of write till I find the energy and I find the voice, and I just keep writing till it kind of accumulates towards something that looks like a novel, and then I have to go back and do so I write very messy first drafts and then kind of go back and try and shape them into something. And with nonfiction, particularly longer nonfiction, I've become much more, and I think this has really happened since I had kids and I had to learn to write differently, because you have to learn to work differently once you have children. I've gotten much more inclined, if I don't know how to write the whole thing, to go, well, I know what the bits I have to write are, so I'll write some of the bits and then I'll work out the rest. But I'm a very unstructured kind of writer. So what I'm always looking for, I'll often go into a novel knowing almost nothing. I'll have a title, or I'll have a couple of scenes or something like that, and then I just kind of wander around until I find the pieces. So it's very unstructured. There's that old, architects and gardeners thing. I'm very much a gardener, But simultaneously, I think structure really matters. So one of the things you're doing there is trying to evolve a structure always. But what you're looking for is a voice. You're looking for a texture, a sense of kind of energy, and I don't know how to do that by planning. I only know how to do that by kind of growing it. So
okay, now this one is from Matt. He says, "Hi James, thanks for the book, thoroughly enjoyed it, finished it this afternoon." He noticed on pages 30 and 31, and I'm sure you know what's on every single page, when Davis was introducing Jay and Kate to areas of Tasmanian bushland with re-engineered lichen, Davis noted that they'd altered its genetic clock to make them faster growing, and also altering their capacity to absorb CO2. So what he would like to know is, how accurate is your research to having these genetically altered species reintroduced to help the planet? And did you find an ethical debate at research level that these reintroduced lichens may outcompete the unengineered lichens?
I fear I probably just made most of that up. Look, I did do some research around it. I now don't remember what I what I found in that area. But I mean, I think that there's certainly things that people have talked about, you know. So I mean, I think that I was probably harvesting the speculative science rather than the scientific literature there. So I mean, it was very much about kind of, you know, yeah, it's probably not that closely researched, let's say. You know, I mean, it feels sciencey rather than being science. Yeah, but I mean, but there certainly are a number of things going on in that kind of space about, you know, how could we re-engineer species? Could we do any of those kinds of things? And there are clearly kind of big ethical problems about all of that. And also there are obviously kind of ecological problems with it, you know, so that's kind of interesting. I mean, it's like, you know, introducing those giant salmon into the rivers. I mean, it's probably not a great idea, you know. So yeah, it was, yeah.
Rosanne would like to know, have you always been an author, or do you have a scientific background?
No, I have no scientific background. I haven't always been an author. I studied philosophy and almost became a philosopher, and then I was a lawyer for a little while, not for very long, and I was a fairly undistinguished lawyer. But I guess I've always been interested in science, and I, you know, I kind of did science at school. I've always read popular science. I've always been interested in it, and I'm really fascinated by scientists. Like, I love talking to scientists. I love listening to them talk about their work. I love kind of learning about their process, because there's a kind of energy and you know, they're kind of, the intellectual excitement they get from their work, I find really contagious. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist, and I'm acutely aware of that when I'm writing nonfiction. I'm always very careful about getting scientists to check what I've written and things like that. But I kind of love science. I love that way of looking at the world, that way of thinking about the world, and the way it kind of enlarges our world when we engage with it.
Dan would like to know, did you pick the person who reads your books on Audible? You don't pick them, do you?
Well, no, not really. With one of my books, one of the things that's interesting is the degree to which audiobooks have become part of the process. So over my last 3 or 4 books, audiobooks used to be a kind of afterthought that you got. Then they were something that happened quite quickly. And now they're an integral part of the kind of process. So they make the audiobook before the book comes out. Now, certainly with some of the books, I remember at one point getting an email asking which narrator I would like, but they'd actually recorded it like 3 days before with one of the narrators. So I wasn't really given a choice at that point. With this one I did. They came to me with a couple of suggestions, and the guy who did it, who I think is terrific, and I'm now completely blanking on his name, Rupert, oh, I'm so embarrassed, I can't remember his name. He's terrific. He does lots of things, but I had actually heard him do a couple of things, and I thought he was fantastic, and I said, get him. He's terrific. So I was really pleased that they got him. So with this one, I did kind of have a choice, but I think most of these things, they offer you a couple of choices, and you get. It's not like you get. Look, probably if I had come along and said there's someone I really wanted, they would have let me do that. In fact, the guy who lives around the corner records audiobooks and has done all the Jane Harper ones, and is, you know, and is terrific at it. You know, lovely guy who lives right nearby, who I see all the time. But yeah, it's a fascinating process though, because it's now absolutely integral to the process of releasing books. Yeah. You know,
they're massively popular.
Yeah, well, my daughter listens to them all the time. You know,
I always have one on the go. One of 4 books that I read at once. Robin would like to know, she's talking about how fiction is powerful, but she also really enjoys your non-fiction and would love a book-length collection of this. Do you feel at heart a fiction writer who writes non-fiction on the side, or are you strongly engaged with multiple genres as a generalist writer?
I'm excited that you like non-fiction. That's very nice of you. I think in my head, I'm a novelist who writes nonfiction. And I really care about the nonfiction that I write, and I enjoy writing it. But I am always struck when I deal with people who write nonfiction permanently, or kind of who mostly write nonfiction, that their kind of engagement with the craft of it is much deeper than mine. You know, whereas with fiction, I feel very engaged with the craft of it. You know, with nonfiction, I just kind of do what I do. Does that make sense?
Mm.
But having said that, you know, like I really enjoy that capacity to kind of move between things. I get huge pleasure out of writing nonfiction because it's something concrete in a way that fiction often isn't. And particularly if it's something in that kind of space where it's about the environment or something, you feel like it does something, like it's got a kind of immediacy that the fiction doesn't necessarily have. And then having said all of that, if I spend a month writing nonfiction, I'm desperate to get back to fiction. So it's a kind of, I like them both and I like them for different reasons, but I think I probably think of myself as a novelist who writes nonfiction.
Yeah. So this is from Jen. Hi, James. Everything you write strikes so close to home. I agree that the best science fiction is not so much about technology and what makes the future, but is about how we see ourselves as a society and the places we can go. But how do you make sure that it's not too didactic when you write? How do you get these important ideas into your stories?
It's very nice of you, Jen. Thank you. That's a really interesting question, isn't it? I do worry about that kind of, about whether things become didactic. I guess what it's about is trying to get always to the kind of emotional and human core of the thing you're writing about. So for me, what always matters with the books is not the kind of message that they're bearing. And, you know, I'm not sure that good fiction has simple messages in that way. But in as much as they do have kind of message, climate change is bad. That's not what they're about. What they're about is those kind, you know, trying to capture the sense of living in that time. They're about the characters and their kind of things that are going on with them and the kind of emotional textures of the characters. So in a sense, I guess the way you avoid the didacticism is by coming back always to that kind of human core, or that kind of emotional core. Because I mean, I think at the end of the day, you know, novels are great because they do all of this kind of, you can do kind of intellectual work with novels, but at the end of the day, they're really kind of systems of emotion. Does that make sense? They are about making people feel things. They're about making people respond to things. They're about communicating feeling to people. John Banville once said that, you know, when he writes a novel, it's like what he thinks it's like is like having a very vivid dream and then managing to write it down so that when someone else reads it, they'll have the same dream. And that's kind of what you want to do with fiction, I think.
This is from Julie. Do you spend a lot of time naming your characters? They're not as good as Dickens' names, I'd have to say, if I'm going to say something negative.
No, names are really, really hard. When I wrote The Resurrectionist, actually, I went through a process where I sat and did, in fact, exactly what Dickens did. And I wrote out words that kind of I associated with the characters and then looked for names that went with them. I do spend quite a lot of time on names, but I find them really difficult because you kind of want them to be doing work in the novel, but simultaneously, by the time they're doing that, often they feel a bit much. But yeah, the names are something I spend a lot of time on. And then, you know, so in Clade, the characters, there's a kind of biblical thing where you've got kind of Adam, and the book's about 70 years long. So it's, you know, kind of, you know, there's that kind of sense that it's a kind of biblical lifespan, and that, you know, that it's about this kind of thing. But I must say, after I'd done that, I you know, with a bit of distance, I wonder whether the names were too much, you know, but by that point they were the characters' names, you know, and I couldn't change them. So you'll also get this thing where you'll give a character a name and then after a while you decide that name's too much or not right, but it's the character's name and you can't change it. In fact, the book I'm writing at the moment, I'm trying to change a character's name because I gave them this name at the beginning and now it just seems silly. You know, it's like, and I'm finding it really, really hard. You know, I'm finding it really difficult. I can't change this character's name, because every time I give them this new name, I'm like, that's not their name. You know, that's not who they are. Who they are is contained in the name that they had. It's going to change.
Well, make sure someone catches them all. Nothing more discombobulating than when a character's name changes in a published novel.
Well, it's like, I just read something else fabulous I read recently was the third of the Hilary Mantel,
oh yes,
The Mirror and the Light, which is amazing. I mean, there is that moment when you're 2/3 of the way through when you think the heat death of the universe is going to arrive and I'm still going to be reading this book. But it's incredible. But also, it's got that thing that Russian novels have got, where it's not just that there's 700 characters. It's that they change their names all the time. You know? They've got like 3 different names, all of them. So you're like, who's this? Who's this? And you're constantly looking at the kind of dramatis persona.
Now, this is from Suzanne. So she says, hi, James. On behalf of City of Parramatta Libraries, I'd like to thank you and the organisers for a wonderful discussion. Her question is, why do you love libraries? And she says, happy Science Week.
Oh, thank you very much, Suzanne. That's really nice. Why do I love libraries? At the moment, I love the library because I've been doing lots of research, and having access to scientific journals, having access to books, you know, that kind of capacity, particularly I've been using Sydney University's library, that capacity to go, I need to read a book, and I can actually just go onto my computer and look at that book, or I can find that article, is just, you know, I couldn't actually write the thing I'm writing, which is nonfiction, without being able to do that. But I actually think one of the things that's really fascinating about libraries is that they've changed so much. I mean, I was really struck, in fact, during the pandemic, one of the first things they closed down was libraries. And, you know, libraries are such important places. I mean, not just because kids go there to study, not just because people go there for books, not just because kids go there for books, but because they've become such incredible community hubs, and particularly I think in less advantaged areas. I've got a friend who runs one of the councils out in Western Sydney, and she was saying it had been a disaster for them because all of these libraries had shut. And she said, this is where all of our people come. It's where they can access the internet. It's where there's a kind of democratic function to them, where they allow people to participate in society and kind of access things that they would not necessarily be able to access. And I think that is just unbelievably important. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of social function is incredibly important. It's not just about reading, it's not just about accessing books, it's about providing those kind of information and technological services, and just a kind of place to be safe to lots of people.
I heartily agree. Joan asks, does writing energize or exhaust you?
Both. Oh look, some of the writing I do is pretty intense emotionally, and I find that quite difficult. Someone once said to me, you know, does writing about kind of climate change make you feel, you know, as a way of processing your feelings? I'm like, no, it makes me feel worse. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I find that if I'm working on something I find really interesting, and to go back, in fact, I think it's Robin's question about nonfiction. One thing about writing nonfiction is if I'm writing nonfiction and I'm really engaged by it, I can't sleep. I can't talk about anything else, you know, and I drive my poor partner mad. You know, kind of, we go for a walk and I just talk, like, and I'm, you know, I try and stop myself doing it, but I know I do it, you know, and I will just say, now you need to know about the incredibly interesting thing I've learned about the origin of water, you know, and it's like, for the next 15 minutes, I'll explain the thing I've been researching, you know, which and you know, that's a kind of symptom of being excited about it. So, yeah.
Well, we've actually run out of time. We do have more questions, but I think we need to wrap up and let you go and have your dinner. So I wanted to say thank you so much, James, for being here tonight. Thank you for your conversation, and thank you for your books. I found Ghost Species beautiful, haunting. It was very real, but also dreamlike. It was scary, but hopeful. And it's really stayed with me like all the best novels do. So thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everyone who came to watch, and we hope to see you at our next author event. Good night.